Hi, I'm Paul Guppy. I'm Vice President for the Washington Policy Center, and this is our regular update of what is going on in the state capitol as our lawmakers there consider issues that are going to impact all of us in the coming years. So they're working on a variety of bills. I picked out 5 items to cover today. And of course, if you want more information about what's happening in the legislature, you can always check our website, which is washingtonpolicy.org. So the first issue to point out is that we are in week 6 of the legislative session, which is day 41 of a scheduled 105-day session. And actually, just recently, this last week, the first policy cutoff date went by. That was February 17th. And the way that the legislature organizes their work internally is they set a cutoff date that if a bill has not passed a policy committee by February 17th, then it's considered to be dead for the session. Of course, these are only internal rules, so the Democratic leadership can always bring up any bill at the end of the session and pass it that way, or they can. These deadlines do not apply to fiscal and budget bills, so those will be considered later on in the session. In the meantime, major issues that the legislature is dealing with is affordable housing. So we have just released a major study which points out to lawmakers that a lot of the cost of building a home in Washington state is created by the government. So we simply went through and listed and measured all the ways that government artificially adds to the cost of building a home. So this has nothing to do with the cost of the land, the cost of materials, labor, the actual physical building of a house. Instead, our main identified obstacle to affordable housing in our state is the 1990 Growth Management Act. Now, virtually everybody knows that that law was designed to preserve open spaces and set up a barrier literally around every community in the state, which says you can't build beyond this point, at least not in a certain density. Our point is our measurements show that the Growth Management Act adds about 24% to the cost of building a home in areas where they're approved. And that works out to be about $140,000 is added to the cost of a median home simply because of government regulations and restrictions. Our point is not to have urban sprawl and, pave the countryside. Nobody's in favor of that. But that the growth management boundaries are simply too strict, and that if Seattle and other communities and the state legislature allowed local communities to allow more building beyond or move the growth management line to make more buildable land available, that would immediately reduce the cost of housing by 10 or 20%. So that's our top recommendation. Our next recommendation is to get rid of ridiculous regulations. So, for example, the governor just led an effort to ban natural gas heating in new construction. Our calculations show that this is going to add about $24,000 to the cost of building a new home. And so we just want to show what that regulation is. Another example is that we picked one city, Seattle, the largest city, and pointed out that to get a permit involves 60 pages of regulations. One typical fee that the city charges is $271 for what they call vacancy inspection. So even if you have a piece of property with nobody living on it in a home, you still have to pay the city to come by and certify that it really is vacant. And that's a fairly small thing, but it's emblematic of the way that the city operates altogether. There is no consideration about what the cost of these regulations mean for the average homeowner, for young people who are trying to get their first home, for entrepreneurs and home builders that are trying to increase the supply of affordable housing. And so we think that they should look at taxes and regulations first before they move to a multi-billion-dollar subsidy program, which is what the legislature is looking at there. So that's our first issue. I have 4 other bills that I'm going to touch on. The next one is a bill, HB 1333, introduced by Representative Ramos of Issaquah. And this was done at the request of the Attorney General, Bob Ferguson. Bob Ferguson had put out a report about what he calls a major problem in our state, domestic violence extremism. So this bill would create a new state commission that would define what a new crime is in our state, domestic violence extremism. So as analysts, we of course wanted to read the report, read the bill, and see what this is about. And we were a little bit surprised to see that what Attorney General Ferguson's proposing is a Ministry of Truth idea that was already debated by the Biden administration, created a huge national debate, and President Biden pulled back and canceled that idea. And then here we turn around and see that exactly the same idea is being proposed at the state level. The ways that this would work is that the commission, the Ministry of Truth Commission, would decide what words, phrases, expressions constitute what the government considers misinformation, and develop a, quote, toolkit of legal options in order to prosecute this new crime. It also refers to what's called precursors to acts of terrorism. So a precursor means something that hasn't happened yet. And so there you could actually have an offense where words, phrases, expressions could fall under this definition, and then you'd be subject to possibly to being prosecuted under the law. Our analyst testified against this bill, Lee Finna, basically making the argument for free speech and protecting civil rights. The bill has obvious First Amendment implications under our national Constitution, but even so, the bill passed the House State Government Committee, and it's now in the Appropriations Committee. So it made that policy cutoff date that I mentioned earlier, and so that bill is still alive and it could be passed. It reminds us a lot of a bill that was proposed last session by Governor Inslee. That was SB 5842. That would have made it a crime to criticize the outcome of an election. We objected on the same grounds, free speech grounds, and that bill died a well-deserved and ignominious death in committee. So we're hoping that HB 1333 meets the same fate. We're really concerned, but also surprised that the top law enforcement official in our state is pushing a radical free speech suppression bill like this. So we'll see what happens with that. The third issue I'll cover is a little bit obscure, but we think still important. It's called Senate Joint Memorial 8006. And this was proposed in the Senate Health and Long-Term Care Committee. And basically what it does is ask the federal government to create a socialized universal healthcare system for the United States. So our question is, why is a state committee making this recommendation to the government? Our healthcare analyst, Elizabeth Hubby, testified against it, and her argument was socialized healthcare has not worked in any state that's tried it. Vermont tried it, Hawaii tried it, they all pulled it back. We don't think it'll work in Washington state either. But more than that, she referred to this joint memorial as nothing more than like a note from mom. The way Elizabeth put it is that it's like state lawmakers saying to the federal government, hey, Tooth Fairy, create a socialist healthcare system in the United States. And we just know that that's not going to happen. So we dug a little deeper as to why they went through this exercise. And it appears that I think it was done to save embarrassment for Senator Hasegawa, who was a senior member of the committee. He had been promoting another proposal called Whole Washington Socialized Healthcare. That was pushed as an initiative. It fell way short of getting the signatures to qualify for the ballot, so it completely failed. We think that this memorial is a way for Senator Hasegawa to save some embarrassment and at least get an official statement from the legislature that the federal government should create a socialized healthcare system for all of us. It has no teeth. It's non-binding. It's purely symbolic. But even so, we were complimented when Senator Padden, who's the ranking Republican on the committee, called Elizabeth's testimony, quote unquote, right on. He said it was just right. And that's what we like to hear from lawmakers when we're able to provide positive information about what a piece of legislation would do. The fourth issue is, on a more positive note, a really positive reform called SB 5499. This has broad bipartisan support, and what it would do is allow Washington state to join a pre-existing agreement among 37 states that accept nurse licensing among the states. So after the COVID crisis and when hospitals were having a hard time getting nursing help, and we still have that now, this bill would allow Washington to accept the credentials of nurses who work in 37 other states, could possibly move here. This bill passed in committee, the Education and Workforce Committee, by a vote of 11-3, so very strongly bipartisan. Our healthcare expert testified in favor of it. We also see this as a freedom to work, occupational licensing issue, that if a person is qualified in Kentucky or Ohio or Pennsylvania, why shouldn't they be equally qualified to work in Washington state? So we're hopeful that that bill will pass. We were a little surprised that it was in the Workforce Committee and not in the Healthcare Committee in the House. And we discovered that the reason for that is that Healthcare Committee had always blocked this proposal in the past, led by Representative Eileen Cody, who is a registered nurse and a member of the union. and the union strongly opposes allowing nurses from other states to work in our state. Representative Cody, very respected, served in the legislature for a long time, but she retired last year. So she is no longer there to block this idea, and that's why we think the bill is moving forward. And the last issue I'll touch on quickly is the main work of the legislature in this coming session is to pass a 2-year budget. They have not gotten to that yet, so that will be coming up, but we're already seeing early indications of how the budget would go. So a new report came out showing that the state took in $88 million in revenue in the last month, above what was forecasted, and the forecast was already an increase. So that shows that the state is continuing to take in huge amounts of revenue beyond what lawmakers expect. We do not see any tax relief on the horizon. We have been arguing for a property tax cut or a sales tax cut because the state is clearly collecting more money than they need, even for today's larger budget. The bigger picture is the state budget has doubled in about the last 10 years. In 2013, it was $31 billion. Today, the 2-year budget is $64 billion. And the governor has now requested for the next 2-year period a $70 billion budget. We'll see what the legislature comes up with, but that shows what the direction of spending trends have been. We'll continue to keep an eye on that. And then to close, I recommend that people go to WashingtonPolicyCenter.org, as I mentioned before, for more information, but particularly the tab on our site for the blog, because our analysts are posting virtually every day on the issues and bills that they're working on. It's a great way to get a quick, readable update on the top issues that are happening in the legislature virtually every day. Beyond that, we have another episode of our WPC On The Go coming up on February 21st. That's a live Facebook presentation with our analysts talking about what's going on in Olympia. And then a little farther out on March 4th, we have our 16th annual Palm Springs event with a respected guest speaker, Wall Street Journal columnist Jason Riley. That event almost always sells out. It's very popular. We hold it in Palm Springs because a lot of our supporters are there for the winter, but it's a really fun event. It's so popular that a number of our supporters actually fly from Seattle down to the event just to hear the speaker and to have a great time getting together. So that's the latest update, and I'll be back next week with more. Thanks.